In the autumn dust of Montana, a mountain man whispered 3 words to a starving girl that he never meant to say. She laughed, and the sound opened a wound in him that never closed. Welcome to Shadow of the West. Subscribe and ring the bell for more legendary tales of love, courage, and the untamed frontier. There are places in this world where God finished his work and walked away without looking back. The Montana Territory in the autumn of 1868 was one of those places. Mountains rose from the earth like the bones of something ancient and buried. Rivers cut through valleys so deep that sunlight only reached the bottom for a few hours each day. The pines stood so thick on the ridgelines that wind passing through them made a sound like breathing, as if the land itself was alive and sleeping and preferred not to be disturbed. This was not country that welcomed human beings. It tolerated them, the way a river tolerates a stone, by moving around it, by wearing it down, by reminding it constantly that the water was here first and would be here long after the stone was dust. The men who survived in this wilderness were not civilized men. They were shaped by cold and altitude and distances so vast that loneliness became a physical thing, a weight they carried in their chests alongside their heartbeats. They trapped beaver and marten and fox. They traded furs at outposts that appeared and disappeared with the seasons. They spoke to other men rarely, and to themselves constantly, and to God only when the silence became too heavy to carry without assistance. Elijah Cord was one of these men. He was 39 years old, built from the same material as the mountains he lived among. Broad shoulders, thick arms, hands that could set a steel trap in frozen ground, or skin an elk in under 20 minutes, or build a fire in rain that would have discouraged lesser men into surrender. His face was weathered beyond his years. Dark beard streaked with early gray. Deep lines around the eyes from squinting into snow glare and mountain sun and distances that required a man to see farther than most men ever need to look. A scar ran along his left jaw, where a grizzly had reminded him 7 years ago that he was not the most dangerous thing in these mountains. His eyes were dark brown, almost black, the kind of eyes that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, eyes that had seen enough to fill several lifetimes and had decided somewhere along the way that showing what they had seen was unnecessary. He lived alone. He had always lived alone. Not because tragedy had taken someone from him, but because he had never found someone worth enduring the vulnerability that companionship required. The mountains were enough. The silence was enough. The rhythm of seasons and traps and trading posts was enough. He told himself this so often that he almost believed it. The outpost at Bridger Creek was the closest thing to civilization within 100 miles. A trading post, a blacksmith, a saloon that sold whiskey strong enough to remove rust from iron and frequently did, a scattering of tents and shacks where miners and trappers and drifters gathered twice a year to trade what the wilderness gave them for what the wilderness could not provide. Elijah rode into Bridger Creek on the 15th of October with a mule loaded with furs and a list in his head of what he needed: salt, powder, lead, coffee, flour, simple things. The ingredients of a simple life that asked nothing from anyone and owed nothing in return. The town was busier than usual. A wagon train had stopped on its way west, and the travelers mixed with the trappers and miners in the kind of uneasy combination that happens when people who are going somewhere meet people who have stopped going anywhere. He noticed the commotion near the general store first. A small crowd had gathered. Not the excited crowd of entertainment. The uncomfortable crowd of witnessing. The kind of crowd that watches something unpleasant because looking away requires a moral decision they are not prepared to make. He tied his horse and walked closer, not because he cared, because the crowd was between him and the store, and his supplies were inside. Then he saw her. She was sitting in the dirt beside the wooden steps of the general store, not sitting by choice. Sitting because standing was no longer something her body could sustain. She was thin in the way that hunger makes people thin. Not the leanness of hard work, but the diminishment of deprivation, as if her body had been consuming itself from the inside to keep the essential organs functioning, while everything else was surrendered. Her dress had been blue once. Now it was the color of dust and wear, and the particular gray that fabric turns when it has been washed in creek water too many times and dried in sun too harsh for the dye to survive. Her hair was dark, matted, falling around a face that was smudged with road dust and exhaustion. She was, perhaps, 22, perhaps younger. Hunger and hard travel had made her age difficult to determine, but her eyes were clear, brown eyes that held something that starvation and exhaustion and whatever road had brought her here had not managed to extinguish. The crowd muttered. A woman alone at an outpost meant specific things to specific men, and none of those things involved kindness. The store owner stood on the steps above her, with his arms crossed. He had already told her twice that she could not sit there. She had not moved because moving required energy. She had stopped producing days ago. Elijah did not know why he walked toward her instead of around her. 20 years of solitude had taught him to avoid situations that involved other people's problems. Other people's problems had edges that cut anyone who handled them. His life was clean and simple and free of edges, and he preferred it that way. But his boots carried him forward, as if his body had made a decision his mind had not been consulted about. He stood above her, this enormous mountain man in his worn leather coat with fur on his mule, and silence in his eyes. He looked down at this girl in the dust who weighed less than his winter pack and who was slowly disappearing into the ground beneath her as if the earth was already beginning the process of reclaiming what starvation would eventually deliver. The words came out before he could stop them, before he could consider them, before the part of his brain that had kept him alive and alone for 2 decades could intervene and remind him that silence was always the safer choice. "Can I buy you?" He meant food. He meant supplies. He meant, "Can I purchase something for you at this store? Because you are clearly starving, and I have money, and the transaction is simple." He meant the practical, straightforward offer of a man who understood trading and bartering and the exchange of goods for currency. But the words that left his mouth were not the words he intended. They were clumsy, graceless, the words of a man so unaccustomed to speaking to another human being that the mechanism had rusted, and what emerged was broken and wrong and carried a meaning he did not intend. The crowd heard the words. The store owner heard the words. The men standing nearby heard the words and interpreted them exactly as such words would be interpreted at a frontier outpost where women were scarce and morality was flexible. She heard the words. She lifted her face from the dust. Those brown eyes found his dark ones, and in the space between one heartbeat and the buy, next something happened that neither of them expected. She laughed, not a bitter laugh. Not a mocking laugh, not the defensive laugh of a woman who has learned to use humor as armor against the cruelty of men who view her as merchandise. A real laugh, a genuine laugh, the startled, delighted, involuntary laugh of someone who has heard something so absurd that the body responds before the mind can intervene. A laugh that came from the belly despite the belly being empty. A laugh that filled the space around the general store and bounced off the wooden walls and entered the ears of every person present. But it entered Elijah Cord differently. It entered through a door he did not know existed. A door somewhere behind his ribs that 20 years of mountains and silence and self-sufficiency had not sealed as thoroughly as he believed. The laugh passed through that door and touched something inside him that had never been touched. Something soft. Something that had survived the grizzly and the winters and the loneliness because it had been hidden so deep that even he had forgotten it was there. His soul cracked open, not loudly, not dramatically, the way ice cracks on a spring river, a sound so quiet that only the water beneath it knows something has changed. But the crack was there, and through it poured something warm that he had no name for because he had never needed a name for it before. He stood there, frozen, this enormous man who had faced charging bears and frozen rivers and the absolute emptiness of mountain winters. He stood above a laughing, starving girl in the dust and felt the architecture of his entire life shift beneath him, like ground that had seemed solid but was not. "You cannot buy a person," she said, when the laugh subsided. Her voice was hoarse from thirst and disuse, but the words were clear, and they carried a dignity that her circumstances charge ought have made impossible, but did not. "I meant food," he managed. "I meant, can I buy you food?" She studied his face. She saw the scar and the weathering and the confusion, and beneath all of it the genuine, bewildered sincerity of a man who had said the wrong thing for the right reason. "Then say that," she replied, and something moved at the corner of her cracked lips that might have been the beginning of a second smile. Her name was Nora Callahan. She told him this over a plate of stew that he purchased at the outpost kitchen. She ate slowly because her stomach had forgotten what abundance felt like and needed to be reminded gradually. She had come west with a family that was not hers. She worked for them, cooked, cleaned, cared for their children during the crossing. When the family reached Bridger Creek, the husband decided that feeding an extra mouth was a luxury the frontier did not support. He left her with nothing. No money, no provisions, no explanation beyond the economics of survival in a land where compassion was expensive and selfishness was free. She had been alone at the outpost for 11 days, sleeping beneath the general store, eating what she could find, which was almost nothing, waiting for a wagon train that might take her further west, or a miracle that might take her anywhere at all. Elijah listened. He was good at listening because listening required silence, and silence was his primary language. He listened to her story the way he listened to the mountains, with patience, with attention, with the understanding that what was being said was less important than what lived beneath the words. He offered her work at his cabin, 30 miles north in the mountains, cooking and maintaining the homestead while he ran his trap lines. Fair wages, separate quarters. The professional arrangement of a man who needed help with domestic tasks he had been performing badly for 2 decades. That is what he told her. That is what he told himself. But the crack was already there, and through it the warmth was spreading into territories that had been frozen so long they had forgotten what thaw felt like. She accepted, because the alternative was the dirt beneath the general store and the slow, patient hunger that was erasing her one day at a time. They rode north into the mountains. She sat on the mule among the firs. He walked beside his horse and said nothing for 3 hours. She did not ask him to speak, because she understood instinctively that this man's silence was not emptiness. It was fullness, a life so complete in its solitude that words were a foreign currency he spent reluctantly. The cabin surprised her. It was solid, well-built, warm in ways she had not expected from a man who seemed constructed entirely from stone and silence. There were books on a shelf above the fireplace. Poetry, history, a worn Bible with passages underlined in pencil. The interior of this cabin told a story that the exterior of this man concealed. The story of someone who thought deeply and felt deeply and had chosen isolation, not because he was incapable of connection, but because connection terrified him more than any bear or blizzard ever could. Autumn deepened. The aspens turned gold, and then bare. Snow appeared on the peaks and descended toward the valley with the slow inevitability of something that had done this 10,000 times before and would do it 10,000 times again. They developed a rhythm. He trapped, she cooked. He brought meat, she preserved it. He repaired the cabin. She organized its interior with a precision that transformed the space from shelter into home. They ate together in the evenings by the fire, and the silence between them changed texture. It became less like absence and more like presence. The Sile, niece of two people who do not need words, because the words have already been spoken by proximity and consistency, and the quiet accumulation of shared days. She noticed things about him. The way he removed his boots before entering the cabin, as if the space she maintained deserved respect. The way he left wildflowers on the table, without mentioning them. The way he read poetry by firelight, and his lips moved silently, forming the words as if they were prayers he was not ready to speak aloud. He noticed things about her, the way she hummed while cooking. Melodies he did not recognize from a life he had not lived. The way she stood at the cabin door each morning and looked at the mountains as if seeing them for the first time every single day. The way her laugh appeared without warning and without cause, and filled the cabin the way the fire filled it, with warmth and light and the particular comfort of something alive in a cold world. The crack in his soul widened, not painfully, gently, the way a flower opens, the way dawn arrives, so gradually that the moment of change is invisible, and only the result is undeniable. Winter descended with its full authority. Snow buried the valley. The trails closed. The world contracted to the cabin, and the woodpile, and the frozen creek, and the two of them occupying a space designed for one person who had believed one person was sufficient. On a December evening, she found the poetry book open on the table. A passage was underlined in fresh pencil. She read it by firelight, while he pretended to repair a trap that did not need repairing. The words were about finding water in the desert, about discovering warmth in the place you least expected it, about the soul's capacity to open after years of believing it was sealed. She closed the book. She crossed the small cabin. She placed her hand on his scarred, rough, enormous hand that was pea, pretending to work on a trap that was already perfect. "You still cannot buy me," she whispered. His dark eyes met her brown ones. "I am not trying to buy you," he said. "Then what are you doing?" The fire crackled. The snow whispered against the windows. The mountain silence wrapped around the cabin like something protective and ancient. "I am asking you to stay," he said. I do not know the right words. I have never needed them before. I have only the wrong ones. But I am asking." Her hand tightened on his. Her eyes glistened in the firelight. "You found the right ones," she said softly. "You found them in the dust outside a general store when you said the wrong thing and meant the right thing." And I laughed, because no one had ever been that honest with me before. They married in spring when the snow retreated, and the valley floor showed its face again. Green and new and impossibly beautiful after months of white. No preacher, no witnesses, just words exchanged beside the creek while snowmelt rushed past, carrying winter away. Years settled over them like the mountain light. Gentle, golden, a daughter arrived, and then a son. The cabin expanded. Laughter filled the valley the way birdsong filled it. Naturally, without effort, without anyone asking it to, Nora grew strong in the mountain air. Her body recovered what hunger had taken, her face filled with the particular beauty that happens when a person is exactly where they belong. Her laugh remained unchanged. Sudden, warm, the sound that had cracked open a mountain man's soul and let the light pour in. Elijah softened in ways only she could see. The silence remained, but its quality transformed. It became the silence of contentment rather than isolation. The silence of a man who has everything he needs within the walls of a cabin he built with hands that once believed their only purpose was survival. Travelers who passed through the valley in later years sometimes spoke of the homestead in the mountains, the stone cabin beside the creek, the tall, quiet man, and the dark-haired woman whose laugh carried across the water, the children who played among the pines, as if the wilderness was a garden planted specifically for them. They said the man had a scar on his jaw, and poetry on his shelf, and a gentleness that contradicted his size, the way a spring contradicts the rock it flows from. They said the woman told a story sometimes about a day in the dust outside a general store when a mountain man asked her the wrong question, and she laughed, and the laugh traveled through the years like a river through a canyon, shaping everything it touched, slowly, gently, permanently. Some people search the whole world for what they need. They cross oceans and deserts and mountain ranges, looking for the thing that will make their life complete. And some people find it in the dust outside a trading post, in a clumsy question and a genuine laugh, in the simple, terrifying act of saying the wrong words to the right person and discovering that the wrong words were exactly right because they were honest, and honesty is the only language the heart recognizes. Can I buy you? No, you cannot. But you can sit beside me while I eat this stew you purchased, and you can walk me into your mountains, and you can show me your poetry and your silence and the cabin you built for one person that has always had room for two. You can ask me to stay using words you have never spoken before, and I will stay, not because you bought me, because you broke yourself open in front of me and let me see what was inside, and what was inside was worth more than gold. That is what the mountains remember, not the harshness, not the cold, not the winters that test the absolute limit of what living things can end. The mountains remember the laughter, a girl in the dust, a man on his knees without kneeling, a question asked wrong and answered right, and the sound of something cracking open that was never meant to stay closed. The valley still holds her laugh. If you listen closely, where the creek bends past the old stone foundation, you can hear it, mixed with snowmelt and birdsong and the quiet breathing of mountains that have been keeping this story since before anyone thought to write it down. Some say the cabin still stands, Some say only the chimney remains. But the laugh survives. It always survives.